After the pilots fainted on the flight, a millionaire takes control of the plane. What he did while piloting made everyone cry. The morning sun reflected off the silver fuselage of the airplane parked at the boarding gate. Matthew Williams, a 45-year-old man with an imposing appearance and a confident gaze, carefully adjusted his carry-on luggage in the overhead compartment. Beside him, Sophia, his wife, who was 7 months pregnant, watched with a serene smile. Her hand rested on her slightly rounded belly, an instinctive gesture that revealed her affection for the small miracle growing inside her. For Matthew, this flight was a welcome break amidst the whirlwind of business he managed. The fortune he had accumulated over the years was the result of a life of dedication, but at that moment it all seemed insignificant compared to the anticipation of becoming a father. As he helped Sophia settle into her seat, he thought about how his life was about to change. The passengers around them calmly organized themselves in their seats. Soft laughter and murmurs filled the cabin, creating a tranquil atmosphere. However, when Matthew glanced toward the cockpit while the door was still open, he noticed something unusual. The young co-pilot appeared agitated. He was talking to the captain, gesturing nervously. Matthew dismissed his concern, assuming it was just a case of inexperience. As the plane took off and the horizon receded, the couple relaxed. Matthew leaned his seat back slightly and watched Sophia as she flipped through an in-flight magazine. He felt grateful. The journey to the airport had been full of playful conversations about baby names and the hope of some rest before the whirlwind of parenthood. Matthew, who had spent his life accumulating accomplishments, now felt vulnerable in the face of this new responsibility. It was a strange but welcome feeling. The flight seemed promising. The flight attendants served drinks and snacks as the passengers enjoyed the calm typical of cruising altitudes. A child a few rows ahead laughed loudly, trying to catch imaginary bubbles on a tablet screen. Matthew glanced at Sophia, imagining what it would be like the first time their baby laughed so purely and carefreely. Then came the first turbulence. The seatbelt lights turned on with a soft ping, and the plane jolted abruptly. Smiles in the cabin momentarily disappeared, replaced by expressions of mild apprehension. Matthew instinctively grabbed Sophia's hand, and she smiled to reassure him. "It's just a little bump," she said, trying to disguise her own discomfort. The co-pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're encountering a patch of turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Everything is under control." Despite the words, Matthew detected a tremor in the young man's voice. Something about his tone felt off. He looked at Sophia, who now sat upright, her eyes alert. Minutes later, the plane gave another jolt, stronger this time. A flight attendant stumbled in the aisle, dropping a tray of plastic cups. Matthew watched as she tried to maintain her composure, but the tension on her face was evident. Then, the unexpected happened. A loud beep echoed through the cabin, followed by a muffled sound from the communication system. The cockpit door swung open abruptly, and the young co-pilot emerged, his face pale and his eyes wide with panic. He hurried over to a flight attendant, whispering something that drained the color from her face. Matthew, ever the keen observer, caught key words: pilot, medical issue, and emergency. The co-pilot returned to the cockpit, and moments later his voice came through the speakers again, now unmistakably nervous. "Ladies and gentlemen, we regret to inform you that our captain has experienced a medical emergency and is incapacitated. We are working to manage the situation. Please remain calm and follow the instructions of the crew." The impact of his words rippled through the cabin like a shockwave. Some people began crying, others spoke loudly, questioning the situation. Matthew felt Sophia squeeze his hand tightly. He said nothing, but his heart began to race. The confidence that had always been part of his personality seemed to crumble under the weight of the unexpected. Toward the back of the cabin, a middle-aged man began praying aloud, his voice shaky. A young woman tried to stand. only to be instructed to return to her seat by a flight attendant. Matthew closed his eyes for a moment, searching for clarity amidst the chaos. When he opened them, his gaze locked on the cockpit. He needed to know what was happening. The plane trembled again, but this time the movement was more violent. A metallic noise reverberated through the cabin, and the main lights flickered. Then the oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments, swaying in front of the astonished faces of the passengers. Panic set in. A woman began screaming hysterically, while a child cried loudly. A man tried to calm his wife, but his own voice trembled. The sound of passengers pulling down the masks echoed through the cabin, mixed with murmurs of prayers and uncontrolled cries. Matthew took a deep breath and helped Sophia put on her mask. His hands were steady, but her eyes revealed growing fear. "It's going to be okay," he said, holding her face briefly. Sophia nodded, trying to trust his words, even though Matthew himself wasn't sure what was coming next. In the cockpit, the co-pilot struggled to maintain control. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling as he tried to input commands into the electronic panel. Communication with air traffic control was patchy, and his voice sounded like someone on the verge of collapse. "This is the co-pilot of Flight 7435. I'm alone in the cockpit. The captain is unconscious and I don't have the experience to handle this," he shouted into the radio, his voice laden with desperation. On the other end, air traffic control tried to reassure him. "Stay calm, co-pilot. We'll guide you, but you need to follow our instructions precisely. Can you do that?" He hesitated before responding. I'll try." In the cabin, Matthew was watching everything closely. He noticed the chaos around him, but something inside him felt different. Despite the fear, his mind analyzed the details. The co-pilot's behavior, the tone of voice in the announcements, the irregular vibrations of the plane. Something was very wrong, and the co-pilot's nervousness didn't inspire confidence. Sophia touched his arm, interrupting his thoughts. "Matthew, what are you thinking?" He looked at her, realizing how hard she was trying to stay calm, maybe more for his sake than her own. "Something needs to be done," he replied, his voice low but firm. Sophia's eyes widened. "Matthew, you can't." Before she could finish, he was already standing. "Trust me, Sophia." Matthew approached the cockpit, where a flight attendant was blocking the entrance, her face tense with worry. "Sir, please return to your seat," she said, nervous but trying to sound authoritative. "Listen, I'm not just a regular passenger," Matthew said, keeping his tone calm. "I have experience that might help." The flight attendant hesitated, suspicious. "What do you mean by that?" Before he could respond, the co-pilot partially opened the cockpit door. His youthful face was pale, and his hands were visibly shaking. "Who's out there?" he asked, his voice nearly cracking. Matthew looked him straight in the eyes. "It's me, and I can help." The co-pilot looked confused and desperate. He scanned Matthew up and down, taking in the impeccably dressed man with a confident posture. "Are you a pilot?" Matthew didn't answer immediately, but his expression alone conveyed the assurance the young man needed. "I know planes. Let me in, and we'll do this together." As Matthew entered the cockpit, the passengers watched in silence, some with disbelief on their faces. A murmur spread quickly. "He's just a businessman. How can he help?" someone said. "We're in the hands of a passenger now. This can't be serious," another shouted. Sophia, still seated, tightened her seatbelt, her heart racing. She knew Matthew was a talented and confident man, but this was far beyond what anyone could expect from him. In the cockpit, Matthew sat in the captain's seat, quickly adjusting to the unfamiliar environment. He looked at the control panel and then at the co-pilot, who still seemed paralyzed. "Listen, I'm going to need you to trust me and maintain communication with air traffic control. We can do this together." The co-pilot took a deep breath, as if trying to absorb some of Matthew's confidence. "Okay, Okay, what do we need to do? Matthew began examining the instruments and familiarizing himself with the controls as the voice from air traffic control came through the radio again. This is air traffic control. Who is in command now? Matthew picked up the radio. My name is Matthew Williams. I'm taking over with the co-pilot's assistance. I need precise instructions to stabilize this plane. There was a brief silence from air traffic control before they responded. Mr. Williams, are you ready to follow our instructions? Matthew looked at the controls one more time, took a deep breath and responded firmly. I'm ready. Let's save this plane. The cockpit door closed behind Matthew, muffling the chaos from the main cabin. Inside the cramped space, the control panel glowed with blinking lights and intermittent alarms, a technological cacophony that could intimidate anyone. The young co-pilot, his face still pale, looked like a castaway clinging to a piece of driftwood in the open sea. What exactly do you know about airplanes? The co-pilot asked, his voice heavy with distrust and anxiety. Matthew looked directly at him, projecting a confidence that contrasted sharply with the desperate situation. I know enough to help you land this plane. Let's work together, and we'll make this happen. The co-pilot hesitated, but he had no other choice. He nodded, relinquishing partial control to Matthew. Air traffic control came on the line, and a firm, experienced voice echoed through the radio. Flight 7435, this is Atlanta Air Traffic Control. Identify who is in command of the aircraft. Matthew grabbed the radio, his voice calm but determined. This is Matthew Williams. I'm assisting the co-pilot. I need precise instructions to stabilize this plane. There was a brief silence on the line, as if air traffic control was processing the information. Mr. Williams, do you have experience piloting aircraft? I do, but not commercial planes. I'll need detailed technical support. The controller took a deep breath before responding. Understood. We'll guide you step by step. First, we need to stabilize the aircraft and set a safe altitude. Can you confirm the stabilizer controls? Matthew glanced at the instruments in front of him, recognizing most of them, despite the cockpit being very different from the ones he had encountered in his youth. He quickly adjusted the controls and responded precisely. Controls responding, stabilizer adjusted. The co-pilot, who had been watching Matthew closely, began to relax slightly. He finally spoke. You seem like you know what you're doing. Seem like it? Matthew responded with a slight smile, trying to lighten the tension. Let's focus on what needs to be done. In the main cabin, Sophia sat silently, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She tried to hide the growing fear with each passing minute, but her eyes frequently darted toward the cockpit door. Matthew's words, "Trust me," echoed in her mind. As much as she knew her husband's strength and capability, the situation felt surreal. The man who had built a business empire was now at the helm of a commercial airplane, with dozens of lives depending on him. And the baby. She couldn't stop thinking about the baby. Another bout of turbulence shook the plane violently, drawing screams from passengers and sending a few objects tumbling to the floor. Sophia gripped the armrests of her seat, trying to steady herself. "Matthew," she whispered to herself, her heart tightening. In the cockpit, the turbulence was accompanied by additional alarms. A red light began flashing on the panel, and the co-pilot, now slightly more composed, tried to assess the situation. "We've got a hydraulic failure warning. This could affect the flap system." Matthew frowned. Compromised flaps meant less control during descent and landing. He grabbed the radio again. "Air traffic control, we're seeing a hydraulic failure warning. I need guidance." The tower responded quickly. "Understood. Flight 7435. This will limit your use of the flaps and possibly the landing gear. Let's prioritize stabilizing the aircraft before planning the landing. Confirm fuel levels and engine status." Matthew checked the indicators, quickly adjusting a few settings. Fuel levels adequate, engines responding. The controller began outlining the next steps while Matthew kept his hands steady on the controls. Even with the turbulence rattling the cockpit, he displayed an almost impossible level of composure. "How are you staying so calm?" the co-pilot finally asked, genuinely impressed. "Because there's no room for error, and I'm not letting anyone lose their life today." The turbulence momentarily worsened, throwing the plane to one side and forcing Matthew to make abrupt adjustments to the controls. He felt sweat trickle down his forehead, but his focus remained unwavering. Meanwhile, in the cabin, Sophia watched as a flight attendant approached her. "Mom, how are you feeling? Do you need anything?" the attendant asked, visibly trying to keep passengers calm. "I'm fine," Sophia replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I just need my husband to be." The flight attendant nodded, unsure what to say, and moved on. In the cockpit, the pressure was beginning to ease. Matthew had managed to partially stabilize the plane, but he knew the biggest challenge was still ahead. He looked at the co-pilot and spoke seriously. "You need to be ready for the landing. Even with my help, it's going to depend on the two of us." The young man nodded, his confidence starting to return. "Okay, what do I need to do?" Matthew looked out at the horizon, the vastness of the sky interrupted only by clouds that still jostled the plane. He grabbed the radio again. "Air traffic control. Advise the nearest airport and begin preparing the runway for an emergency landing." The response came almost instantly. "Mr. Williams, we're redirecting you to Dallas International Airport. The runway is being prepared for an emergency landing." Matthew sighed, momentarily relieved, but fully aware that the hardest part was yet to come. He tightened his grip on the controls and said to the co-pilot, "Let's see this through to the end." Deep down, he knew he wasn't just saving a plane. He was protecting the two lives that mattered most to him, Sophia and the baby she carried. The rhythmic sound of alarms filled the cockpit, but to Matthew it seemed distant. With his hands firmly on the controls and his eyes fixed on the horizon ahead, he felt something familiar. It was as if time had rolled back, transporting him to another era, another cockpit. The radio chatter from the tower buzzed in his ears, but Matthew's mind began to wander to a time when he was a young man in his 20s, with big dreams and an uncontrollable passion for flying. It was a clear, sunny day at the Annapolis Air Base. Matthew, then a young cadet, tightened the harnesses in the cockpit of an F-5 fighter jet, listening to the authoritative voice of his instructor over the radio. "Control is everything, Williams. No matter what happens, stay calm and trust your instruments." He felt adrenaline coursing through him as the jet sped down the runway, lifting off and slicing through the sky. This was his element, the place where he truly belonged. The world below disappeared, and Matthew became part of the infinite blue. His passion for flying had been passed down by his father, a highly respected Air Force pilot. Since childhood, Matthew had admired his father, who would take him to the airbase and explain every detail of the planes. "Never forget, Matthew," his father would say, his voice both stern and loving. "Flying is freedom, but it's also responsibility. It's you against the sky, and the sky doesn't forgive mistakes." Years later, Matthew had become an experienced pilot, taking part in high-stakes missions. He was known for his precision and calm under pressure, qualities that made him one of the best. But this phase of his life came at a high cost. The accident that claimed his father's life was a blow that changed everything. During a training mission, his father's plane suffered a mechanical failure. Despite his skill, he couldn't eject in time. Matthew remembered clearly the day he received the news. He had been on the runway, preparing for takeoff, when a superior approached with a grave expression. "Matthew, it's about your father." His world crumbled in that moment. The man he admired most, who had inspired him to fly, was now just a painful memory. Back in the cockpit of the commercial airplane, Matthew felt his throat tighten. The control panel in front of him overlapped with the memory of the fighter jet cockpit. The responsibility of saving so many lives now placed him back in a position of immense weight, as if fate was testing him once more. The decision to leave aviation came shortly after his father's death. He had promised himself he would never again put his life at such risk. He vowed to honor his father's legacy in another way, without repeating the sacrifices. That's how he built his business empire, keeping his feet firmly on the ground, far from the dangers of the skies. Yet here he was again, with the controls in his hands and dozens of lives depending on his ability to make quick, precise decisions. The co-pilot broke into his thoughts. "Mr. Williams, the tower is requesting confirmation of altitude." Matthew blinked, snapping back to the present. "Confirming cruising altitude. We'll begin descent soon, but I need the landing gear system operational." He analyzed the controls, manually adjusting some settings. His military training was now an invaluable resource. Matthew knew that in aviation every detail mattered. The co-pilot looked at him with growing admiration. "You've flown before, haven't you? This is way more than just some experience." Matthew gave a half smile, but his expression quickly turned serious. "Yes, I've flown, but not like this." "What do you mean?" the young man asked, curious. Matthew hesitated for a moment, but decided to share a little. "I was an Air Force pilot. Combat missions, high-speed flight, but never a commercial plane, and definitely never with so many lives on the line." The co-pilot didn't say anything, but the respect in his eyes was clear. Meanwhile, in the main cabin, Sophia tried to focus on her breathing. Each jolt of the plane felt like a blow to her heart. She knew Matthew was a determined man, but this situation seemed beyond anything he had ever faced. A passenger sitting nearby tried to strike up a conversation, seeking comfort. "He's your husband, isn't he?" Sophia only nodded, unable to say more. "He seems like he knows what he's doing," the woman added, trying to sound optimistic. Sophia glanced at the cockpit door and whispered to herself, "Please, God, protect him." In the cockpit, Matthew adjusted the plane's trajectory as air traffic control gave detailed instructions for the landing. Every command was executed with precision, but he knew the greatest challenge was still ahead. The image of his father returned to his mind, but this time not as a burden, instead as a source of strength. He could almost hear his father's voice. "Trust the instruments. Trust yourself." Matthew gripped the controls more tightly, feeling the weight of responsibility, but also a renewed determination. He wasn't there by chance. He wouldn't just save these people. He would honor the legacy his father had left behind. The sky doesn't forgive mistakes, but Matthew was determined not to make any. The insistent sound of a red alarm invaded the cockpit. Matthew pressed his lips together as he read the message on the instruments. "Hydraulic failure detected." The young co-pilot seated beside him swallowed hard. "This is going to make the landing very difficult," the young man muttered, his voice tense. Matthew nodded. He understood exactly what that failure meant. Critical systems like the flaps, brakes, and, most importantly, the landing gear might not respond properly. Grabbing the radio, he contacted air traffic control. "Air traffic control, we have a hydraulic failure. I need detailed guidance to compensate for the loss of system functionality." The response came almost immediately, but it offered little reassurance. "Flight 7435, we confirm the hydraulic failure. Landing gear operation is compromised. We'll guide you through an alternative procedure." The co-pilot looked at Matthew, panic evident in his eyes. "No landing gear! This is a disaster!" Matthew took a deep breath, his voice firm, but not harsh. "Let's not panic. There's always a solution. Stay focused." In the main cabin, Passengers began to sense the gravity of the situation. The turbulence rocked the plane, and the sound of alarms became more frequent. Sophia watched everything around her, trying to process it all. An elderly passenger, sitting a few seats away, started struggling to breathe, tugging repeatedly at her oxygen mask. Without hesitation, Sophia leaned over. "Ma'am, let me help you," she said, leaning across the armrest. The woman was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Sophia adjusted the mask to fit more securely over her face and tried to calm her. "Take slow breaths, it's going to be okay. My husband is in the cockpit. He knows what he's doing." As she spoke, Sophia wasn't sure if she was trying to reassure the woman or herself. In the cockpit, Matthew worked with the co-pilot to find a solution. He manually engaged levers, checked system redundancies, and tried to stabilize the plane, while air traffic control gave specific instructions to compensate for the failures. "You'll need to release the landing gear manually if possible," the tower explained. "There's an emergency lever below the main panel." Matthew located the lever and tried to pull it, but it was stuck. He strained, feeling sweat bead on his forehead. "It's jammed." "I need more force here," he said to the co-pilot. The young man joined Matthew, and together they wrestled with the mechanism. After a collective effort, they heard a metallic snap. The landing gear indicator light flickered but didn't fully illuminate. "It looks like only part of the system deployed," the co-pilot said, exasperated. Matthew nodded, trying to remain calm. "Better than nothing. We'll adjust the descent with that in mind." In the cabin, tension escalated by the second. A woman sobbed uncontrollably while a group of passengers prayed loudly. An older man tried to calm others. "They know what they're doing. We have to trust the crew." Sophia, still tending to the elderly woman, glanced toward the cockpit door again. Her heart was heavy, but her mind was resolute. Matthew needed to know she trusted him, even as everything seemed out of control. Another wave of turbulence hit the aircraft, throwing passengers against their seatbelts and sending objects tumbling down the aisle. The plane tilted dangerously to one side, eliciting screams and more panic. In the cockpit, Matthew gripped the controls tightly, fighting to stabilize the aircraft. "Air traffic control, we're encountering heavy turbulence. I'll adjust the angle to minimize impact," he reported. He manually adjusted the remaining functional flaps as the plane shook. The co-pilot, now more confident under Matthew's leadership, followed his commands without hesitation. "Reduce speed by 5% and adjust the angle of the right wing. We'll counteract the turbulence drift," Matthew instructed. The co-pilot carried out the orders, and the plane began to level out. The brief calm gave Matthew a chance to refocus. He turned to the co-pilot and asked, "Are you with me?" "I am. Let's finish this together." Matthew picked up the radio again. "Air traffic control. Turbulence is easing. The landing gear appears partially operational, but I'll need further instructions for the landing." The response was steady. "Understood, Flight 7435. We'll guide you through an emergency descent procedure. Prepare for a hard landing." Matthew set down the radio and turned to the co-pilot. "We're in control now. Let's bring these people home." In the back of his mind, a single phrase echoed. "Trust the instruments. Trust yourself." It was almost as if he could hear his father's voice, reinforcing his resolve. As the plane approached the airport, Matthew knew the moment of truth was imminent. He tightened his grip on the controls, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders, but his determination stronger than ever. The aircraft continued its course, occasionally jolting but now stable enough for Matthew to focus on the most critical stage, the final approach for landing. The control panel in front of him flashed with warning lights, but he ignored them, concentrating solely on the tower's instructions and his own experience. The voice of the air traffic controller came through again, steady and firm. "Flight 7435, this is Dallas Control. You're 10 minutes from final approach. We need to review emergency procedures for landing without full landing gear." Matthew responded with determination. "Understood, Control. Let's review." As the tower listed the steps, Matthew felt the weight of the moment. Every detail was crucial, adjusting the speed for approach, compensating for impact on touchdown, ensuring the descent was slow enough to prevent a total collapse of the plane. Despite his calm demeanor, Matthew was acutely aware that the greatest challenge wasn't just technical. The psychological pressure was immense. He knew everyone's lives depended on his ability to stay focused, but the thought of Sophia and the baby tightened his chest like a vice. In his mind, he pictured her face, the happy moments they had shared, her laughter when they decided on the baby's name, the dreams they had for the new life they were building together. And now, here he was, not just risking his own life but their future. "I can't fail," he thought, gripping the controls. Not with her, not with the baby. Outside the cockpit, Sophia kept her eyes fixed on the door. Even without seeing Matthew, she could feel the tension rising. The way he had taken control of the situation reminded her why she loved him so much. Matthew had always been the kind of man who faced challenges head-on, but this was a test of unimaginable limits. At the same time, Sophia knew he was fighting for her, for them, and that gave her the strength to hold on, even as fear gnawed at her. A passenger beside her, still tearful, whispered, "How does he do it?" Sophia took a deep breath before answering, with a strength she didn't know she had. "Because he knows what's at stake." In the cockpit, the co-pilot was showing clear signs of transformation. At first, he had seemed a young man haunted by the weight of responsibility, but now something had shifted. He watched Matthew closely, absorbing every decision and instruction. "Adjust the throttle by 5% and reduce the descent angle to avoid overloading the remaining flaps," Matthew instructed, his voice firm yet calm. The co-pilot executed the command with precision and looked at Matthew. "I never thought I could handle something like this." Matthew glanced at him. "You're handling it. That's what matters." It was true. The co-pilot, once hesitant and uncertain, now seemed to be regaining his confidence. Under Matthew's leadership, he had found the strength he needed. When air traffic control finally gave the green light for final approach, Matthew took a deep breath. "Air traffic control confirmed. Beginning descent." He turned to the co-pilot and explained calmly, "We need to keep the descent controlled and level as much as possible before touchdown. If the landing gear gives out, we need to ensure the impact is minimized." The young man nodded, adjusting the controls as instructed. The plane began its smooth descent, but the silence in the cockpit was almost unbearable. Matthew could feel the tension in the air, even without seeing the passengers. The world outside the windows felt surreal, with the Dallas runway emerging on the horizon like a thin thread of salvation. In the cabin, Sophia felt the change in the aircraft's motion. The silence among the passengers was interrupted by prayers, murmurs, and heavy breaths. She closed her eyes, gripping the armrests tightly. "We're almost there, Matthew. You can do this." In the cockpit, the controller gave the final instructions. "Flight 7435, the runway is clear. Emergency crews are in position. Brace for impact." Matthew responded firmly. "Confirmed. We're ready." He turned to the co-pilot one last time. "This is it. Do your part, and I'll do mine." The young co-pilot nodded, his confidence now matching Matthew's. As the plane approached the runway, Matthew held the controls with surgical precision, adjusting every detail to ensure this landing was more than just an attempt. It was a promise to bring everyone home. The decisive moment was drawing closer. The runway stretched out on the horizon, illuminated by the frantic flashing of emergency lights. Fire trucks and ambulances were positioned, ready to respond. Inside the cockpit, Matthew focused like never before, adjusting the controls for the final approach. The voice of air traffic control came through the radio, calm but firm. Flight 7435, maintain a 2-degree descent angle. Current speed is good, but you'll need to level off as soon as you touch down, Matthew responded, his voice steady with determination. Understood, Control. We're aligned. He glanced quickly at the co-pilot. Remember, our priority is to minimize impact as much as possible. This plane needs to stop before the end of the runway. The co-pilot nodded, adjusting the throttle per Matthew's instructions. In the main cabin, silence hung heavy. The passengers were terrified, but composed, many holding hands. Sophia, her face pale, kept her eyes fixed forward. She knew Matthew was doing everything he could, but the fear of what might happen was overwhelming. She touched her belly and closed her eyes, murmuring a prayer. Please, let him do it. Back in the cockpit, the final approach began. The plane was aligned with the runway, but the dashboard kept flashing constant warnings about the landing gear. Although Matthew had partially unlocked the mechanism manually, he knew it wasn't fully functional. Air traffic control confirming. The front landing gear is still unresponsive. I'm preparing for a forced landing, Matthew reported. The response was immediate. Copy that. Flight 7435. Emergency crews are ready. Stay calm. Matthew adjusted the remaining flaps, trying to maximize lift and reduce the impact. His hands were steady, but his heart pounded like never before. He thought of Sophia, the baby, and every soul aboard the plane. The co-pilot interrupted his thoughts. We're 30 seconds from touchdown. Speed is good. Angle maintained. Hold the course. Be ready for any lateral impact, Matthew replied, gripping the controls tightly. When the rear wheels touched the runway, a violent jolt shook the entire aircraft, eliciting screams from the passengers. In the cabin, oxygen masks swung wildly as Sophia clung tightly to her seat. It's okay, she murmured to herself like a mantra. The rear landing gear seemed to hold the impact, but when the nose gear was supposed to engage, the dashboard emitted another piercing alarm. It didn't deploy, the co-pilot shouted. Matthew tightened his grip on the controls, trying to stabilize the plane as it began to tilt forward. The sound of metal scraping against asphalt filled the cockpit. Air traffic control, the front landing gear has completely failed. We're skidding, Matthew reported, keeping his voice as steady as possible. In the cabin, the aircraft shook violently, and some passengers screamed in panic. Luggage fell from the overhead compartments, scattering into the aisle. Sophia shut her eyes, clutching her seat, and whispered Matthew's name over and over. In the cockpit, Matthew knew he had to act fast. The plane was dangerously tilted, its nose dragging along the runway. He gripped the yoke tightly and gave the co-pilot a quick command. Throttle to idle and deploy the flaps fully to maximize drag. The co-pilot complied without hesitation as Matthew manually steered the rudder to keep the plane centered on the runway. The grinding noise grew louder, but the aircraft began to slow. Suddenly, a new problem arose. The plane started veering left. We're veering off the runway, the co-pilot yelled, panic creeping back into his voice. Matthew quickly adjusted the controls, forcing the rudder to counteract the drift. He knew that if the plane left the runway, the chances of an explosion would increase dramatically. In the cabin, passengers were thrown from side to side as the aircraft seemed on the verge of tipping over. Sophia opened her eyes and saw the runway lights flashing past the windows. No, Matthew, you can do this, she whispered. Matthew made one final adjustment to the controls, using all his strength to stabilize the plane. He forced the rudder in the opposite direction of the skid and managed to realign the aircraft. When the plane finally came to a stop, an eerie silence filled the cockpit. The controller's voice broke through the radio. Flight 7435, confirm. Are you secure? Matthew looked at the co-pilot, who still seemed shell-shocked, and replied with newly regained composure. Confirmed, Control. The aircraft is stationary. Everyone is safe. He released the yoke and exhaled deeply, the weight of the moment finally crashing over him. In the cabin, passengers began to cheer and cry, overwhelmed with relief at being alive. Some hugged their seatmates while others wept openly. Sophia felt tears streaming down her face, a mix of exhaustion and profound gratitude. She knew Matthew had done it. He had achieved the impossible. In the cockpit, Matthew turned to the co-pilot, who finally managed to smile, though he was still catching his breath. "You're incredible. I don't know how you pulled that off." Matthew gave a faint smile, but his gaze remained fixed on the horizon. "It wasn't just for me. I had too many reasons not to fail." He knew that, more than saving a plane, he had safeguarded the future he had always dreamed of with Sophia. The landing had been difficult, but for Matthew, it marked the beginning of something far greater. The sound of emergency vehicle sirens filled the air as the plane sat motionless at the end of the runway. Rescue vehicles surrounded the aircraft, ready to intervene if anything else happened. But inside the plane, tension was beginning to give way to relief. Passengers, still dazed, clapped wildly. Some shouted words of gratitude, while others cried with relief. It was as if everyone was trying to process the fact that they were alive, after an experience that could easily have ended in tragedy. In the cockpit, Matthew unbuckled his seatbelt and leaned back in his chair for a moment. He took a deep breath, finally feeling the weight of responsibility lift from his shoulders. The co-pilot beside him looked at him with admiration. "I could never have done this alone," the young man said, his voice still trembling. Matthew gave a faint smile. "No one does this alone." He stood up and opened the cockpit door, walking into the main cabin. When the passengers saw him, the applause grew louder. It was a deafening sound, but full of emotion. Sophia ran to him as soon as she saw him. Tears streamed down her face, but a smile of relief lit up her lips. "You did it. You saved all of us." Matthew hugged her tightly, feeling her heart racing against his chest. For a moment, the world disappeared. There were no sirens, no applause, just the two of them. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," he whispered. "You and our baby are everything to me." Sophia squeezed his hand and nodded. "And you're everything to us." The plane doors opened, and rescue teams began helping passengers disembark. Some were still in shock, while others wept openly. Matthew helped Sophia down the stairs, but before leaving the aircraft he was approached by a group of passengers. "How did you manage to do that?" an older man asked, his voice filled with curiosity. "You seemed so prepared." Matthew hesitated for a moment. He had never liked talking about his past, especially because it was a part of his life he thought he had left behind. But seeing the expressions on the passengers' faces, he realized he owed them the truth. "I was a pilot in the Air Force," he said simply. A murmur of surprise ran through the group. Matthew continued, "I trained for years and flew dangerous missions. But a long time ago I made a promise to myself that I'd never put my life at risk like that again. I thought it was time to leave it all behind." "Then why did you decide to do this today?" a woman asked, holding a baby in her arms. Matthew took a deep breath, glancing at Sophia beside him. "Because sometimes you have to face your greatest fears for something bigger than yourself." The group stood in silence, processing his words, before breaking into fresh applause. Matthew nodded slightly and descended the stairs, arm in arm with Sophia. On the tarmac, he looked back at the plane one last time. The marks of impact were visible, but the fact that the aircraft was intact was a miracle in itself. He felt a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. "Matthew, are you okay?" Sophia asked, touching his arm. He smiled at her, for the first time in hours, with a completely relaxed expression. "I am. And I think I've never felt more alive." Later, seated beside Sophia in an airport waiting room, Matthew reflected on everything that had happened. He realized that, for all the wealth and accomplishments he had accumulated, none of it compared to saving lives. What he felt in that cockpit, fighting to protect everyone on board, was something no amount of money could buy. He turned to Sophia and held her hand. "I promise you, from now on, I'll be the man our family deserves, a present father, a devoted husband." Sophia smiled and squeezed his hand. "You already are that man." As the sun began to set, Matthew gazed out the window at the plane, now surrounded by maintenance crews. He knew that day would forever be etched in his memory, not just for him, but for everyone who had been on board. More importantly, he knew he had rediscovered something he thought he had lost: the courage to face the impossible and the desire to live life to its fullest. The crisis had revealed the best of him, not just as a pilot or a businessman, but as a human being. I hope you enjoyed today's story. If you did, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought about the story. See you in the next video.